So now, fortunately, we have a little bit more time for question and answers. So I hope we can answer all your questions. I just want to start first with a question about the modeling and then get more into the discussion about nicotine regulation. So this question is for Dr. Zeller. It's in your comment about the use of modeling as a tool to help decision makers understand the impact of policies or regulations. Seems very important for modelers to know. What metrics or pieces of information would you say were the most compelling when sharing those findings with the White House and other decision makers?
Yeah, thanks for the question. For nicotine, it's from the 2018 modeling that was done, the astounding number of people who would, through the end of the century, would not become regular smokers, the resulting reduction in an adult smoking rate, and the projected deaths averted. I would say those three things from nicotine. And while the menthol numbers, weren't as big, the menthol numbers were still huge, and so they were helpful. And while it may not have been sort of as robust, the real-world evidence from Canada when it was projected onto the U.S. population was something that I was able to use in internal discussion. So that's the kind of modeling-based outcomes that were helpful. What I didn't say, but what I should have added was for the nicotine modeling, I was also able to make the case that with the use of expert elicitation, there was a degree of independence that was brought at the front end before we ever found out, what the results would be. That I think once I had the opportunity to explain to people who had never heard what expert elicitation was, brought an additional degree of respect and comfort in the results. Not that anybody would accuse FDA of sort of just going off and making its own assumptions in some kind of preordained way, but I think the fact that the CTP team took the time to go through expert elicitation at the front end was an additional helpful feature when I was trying to explain and, frankly, to sell the need for these product standards to the then new Biden administration.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Our next question is for Dr. Hatsukami. In terms of cessation support, what types of smoking cessation support services and resources should be made visible at the population level in the context of a regulation that reduces nicotine cigarettes?
Well, that's a really good question. I think for one, certainly, having insurance pay for cessation services is really important, as well as nicotine replacement products. We do have a lot of cessation services, and I think that communicating to the population, people who smoke, that these cessation services are available is going to be really important, in combination with communicating what the rationale for the nicotine regulation will be. I mean, basically the rationale is it's going to help people quit smoking. And so, that will, that would probably encourage them. We should probably encourage them to reach out to the quit lines that are available, the state quit lines, as well as the smokefree.gov, site that we have. So again, we do have some good existing programs. We just need to make people aware of them. And also what we need to do, too, is to educate the practitioners as well about the nicotine regulation and also, how they can use this as an opportunity to provide cessation advice as well as materials, refer them to cessation resources. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Our follow-up question is for Mitch Heller, but I think it can, be for both, is what is big tobacco companies doing about low nicotine cigarettes? Are there other low nicotine cigarettes on the market today? Particularly, we know about the existence of the very low nicotine cigarette from the 22nd century group. So I don't know if you want to discuss a little bit about that product, if you know something about, and if you know that they are that other tobacco companies are producing other types of products similar to that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. And as you said, 22nd century actually got a pre-market tobacco product authorization from FDA and permission to make a modified risk tobacco product claim because of the scientific conclusions that we were on when I was there, that we were able to draw about how it would be appropriate for the protection of the public health to have such a product on the market. Historically, there were true, very low nicotine cigarettes on the market, and there were completely fraudulent low and reduced nicotine, so-called low and reduced nicotine products on the market. So just so that everybody understands the history, the fraud is the fraud of the filtered light and low tar cigarette, which was purposely designed to deliver lower tar and nicotine levels on a machine measurement. But the reason why the major cigarette manufacturers in the United States are now all adjudicated racketeers was because it was a fraud, because the industry knew that humans didn't smoke the way the machine smoked. And especially when you consider the role of ventilation holes, where when the machine smoked, the ventilation holes were not blocked, and there really was outside air coming through those almost impossible to see laser perforated holes. As the machine smoked and then measured, there really were reduced levels of tar and nicotine, but that's not the way humans smoke. The holes got blocked, or the technical term was occluded, and that turned it back into a regular cigarette, because for the most part, the nicotine content inside the so-called low nicotine cigarette was as high as the nicotine content of a regular cigarette. And the incredible value of the work that Dorothy and colleagues have done is to help the regulator conclude that the solution here is to start with a very low level of nicotine inside the rod in the first place. Now, by contrast to the fraud, there were a few very low nicotine cigarettes on the market. Philip Morris manufactured a product called Next in the early 1990s, where they used a process known as supercritical extraction, which is the same method that is used to decaffeinate coffee to remove nicotine from tobacco leaves. And that was a genuinely very low nicotine cigarette that was briefly on the market. And then more recently, late 1990s, maybe early 2000s, there was a product called Quest, which was a step-down product with 3 different levels of nicotine. And the marketing pitch there was step your way to nicotine free. So I guess the point of my going through all that is, first of all, we know it's technologically feasible because the companies have done it. And we know the unintended consequences if we get it wrong. We will just wind up repeating. It wouldn't be an intentional fraud, but we would wind up repeating the mistakes that should have been learned from the deference to the tobacco industry in the absence of regulation, when no one knew better and assumed, well, if there's less nicotine in the product and if there's less tar in the product, the best thing is to quit. But if you can't quit, smoke one of those. So I'm confident that FDA has learned all the lessons so that the risk of those unintended consequences will be minimized. And then thanks to the very robust science and the projected population level impacts from the modeling, I have believed for a very long time that the science is there to support this product standard. It is inevitable that the industry will sue, but I believe that at the end of the day, the science will prevail, which means that ultimately public health will prevail.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. One of the questions I do have, though, is, whether we really need to be wary about any kind of nicotine analogs that will be developed by the industry, whether it be, something like synthetic nicotine or other kinds of nicotine analogs. I think that would be of concern.
It would, but if and any company that wanted to do that and was trying to work within the law as opposed to engaging in a violation of the law and really a criminal undertaking, any company that wanted to modify a cigarette after this product standard goes into effect would have to submit an application to FDA on a pre-market basis. The changes to the product could not be made until FDA authorized them. Now, that's companies that understand the law and are willing to follow the law. Any enterprise after this product standard goes into effect that would try to do that without submitting an application on a pre-market basis and getting authorized would be committing a crime. And so the risk of enforcement action, assuming it could be detected, would be great. And there are very few instances in my experience where you would hear me say criminal act. I mean, normally enforcement action is taken as a civil matter, but I believe that this would cross the line into a crime, and the Justice Department would aggressively pursue it if someone knew the law and was purposely trying to evade it.
Thank you so much. Then I want to use this question to follow one question to Dr. Mitch Zeller, but this is particular for Dr. Hatsukami and other researchers that are attending here. Dr. Zeller mentioned that something that was very important for them when they showed the evidence to the policymakers was also to use evidence from other countries and then model it adapted to the US. This question is there a group of scientists who are following the results of New Zealand implementing a nicotine standard? So we have more data to implement a nicotine standard in the US?
Yeah, I think the ITC project that is being led by Jeff Bong and Mike Cummings, they do have a supplement. I'm not quite sure who is leading that specific project, but they do have a supplement that they will be following the people in New Zealand as the act, their action plan goes into effect. So that's happening. New Zealand itself is going to be, monitoring what the impact is going to be. And we also have a supplement, and I believe Rachel Denlinger now has an R01 that will be following the perceptions of nicotine product standard among populations that experience the greatest health disparities. So among the Maori, for example, the indigenous population, among the population that has a history of substance use, and also a population that has mental health issues. And so they will be following them to get an idea of what their perception beliefs are about the nicotine product standard, as well as what they perceive as some of the challenges that they might experience, which would be really valuable in terms of knowing, how to prepare for a nicotine product standard.
And the only thing I would add is a sort of inside baseball notion, and that is the regulator to regulator communications. When I was center director, we established a formal memorandum of understanding with our colleagues in New Zealand that enabled both sides to share confidential non-public information. Now, I've been out of government for over a year, so I don't know the state of that relationship today, but I can assure you that when I was there, there was a very good back and forth regulator to regulator on the issue of nicotine.
Thank you so much. And I want to take on Dr. Hatsukami's point when she was discussing about the study in New Zealand, the Maori population. One of the questions for our audience, and this person mentioned that she was asked this question during a presentation, And it was, is the reduction of nicotine another form of the colonization of tobacco? And it was asked by a Navajo elder. So what's your take on that?
So, I think the real issue there is it is a commercial tobacco product that we are trying to have a standard where it won't be as harmful, even among the population of Native Americans. We certainly aren't talking about the traditional tobacco products where, it would include not only tobacco, but other constituents. So, I think it's important to realize that this is independent from the traditional tobacco products. We're talking about altering the commercialized tobacco products in such a way that it does reduce harm by making it non-addictive. And so, I think that certainly isn't, part of the colonization. It's really undoing the harms that we did by the colonization that occurred by commercializing the tobacco products and that are very highly addictive.
Especially since the smoking rate amongst indigenous populations is much higher than the national average. I do think, though, it is a good point to keep in mind because it is important to respect and preserve the traditional and ceremonial uses. Why that has to result in a higher nicotine product, it should also be a fair question for discussion, because we're not talking about banning cigarettes. And one of the other prohibited acts in the statute that I didn't talk about in my presentation is FDA doesn't have the legal authority and categories of products. So cigarettes will still be there, and cigarettes will still be available for and cigarette tobacco for traditional and ceremonial use. But if there's something related to nicotine content and ceremonial use, I suppose that would need to be discussed.
Thank you so much. And this is a question that is two parts, one following the other. So the first question is for both of speakers. They ask, have we generated enough data to model the impact of reduced nicotine products on the behavior of those smokers called hardened smokers? They refer as hardened as typically highly dependent smokers who have tried to quit on multiple occasions. And if not, which type of evidence should we need? That's the first part. The second part of the question is, what other type of evidence does the FDA needs us as a scientist to produce to support these potential regulation on nicotine levels?
Dorothy, do you want to take the first question?
Yeah, sure. So the projects that we typically have are cigarette smokers that smoke at least 10 cigarettes a day or at least 5 cigarettes a day. So, I think they're, I don't know if you'd call them hardened, but, certainly these are individuals that do smoke on a regular basis and smoke sufficient quantities of cigarettes. And oftentimes, most of the trials that have been conducted are among non-treatment seekers. I think the studies that we haven't done, at this point in time, is really what are some of the ways that we can optimize the effects of the very low nicotine content cigarettes. We touched upon it a little bit, at the very beginning, where we said we need to make the smoking cessation treatments more available to people. But we really haven't married looking at the very low nicotine content cigarettes with adding the smoking cessation services. On top of that, I think I alluded to this too, is that we need to make sure that we can communicate more effectively, the purpose of the nicotine reduction product standard, the opportunities for quitting. And, I think that we need to motivate. I guess what I'm trying to say is that in line with giving motivational messages, we should also provide the smoking cessation treatments. And again, that's a study that needs to be done so we can see whether the hardened smokers actually can benefit from the very low nicotine content condition. I would think that they would, because like I said, many of the individuals that we did work with, they were daily smokers. It is true that the more highly dependent smokers did reduce levels of cigarette smoking to a lesser extent than the individuals that had less dependence on cigarette smoking, but they did reduce their cigarette smoking. So we just need to do more research in terms of how to help the population quit.
And on the second question, Neil and Dorothy's presentation have already covered two of the most relevant and important areas of science that were sure to be in that preamble that I was describing in the proposed and final rule, and that is the underlying science on nicotine and an addiction, and all of the relevant science on nicotine reduction. FDA will choose a level, and then they will have to justify why that is the right level. And the just amazing work that Dorothy has led over the years is critical to that. I think a third area, I'm not sure it's purely scientific information, but it will need to be part of the defense for moving forward on this, is to prove that it's technically achievable. I don't think that's going to be hard. I gave you examples of genuine, very low nicotine cigarettes that the industry has produced, and there was other information to show that, as I alluded to, without going into detail, in the absence of regulation, the tobacco companies could have set the nicotine levels wherever they wanted. They have purposely chose to set the levels where they have been historically, because they knew they were in the drug delivery business. And if you can addict someone as a young person, then you have a customer for 30 or 40 years. And in the absence of regulation, it's why one of the companies very crassly referred to young people as replacement smokers or addicted adult smokers who died or quit. So evidence of the technical feasibility and achievability of this will also be very important.
Thank you so much. And this question is about how would the reduction of nicotine in cigarettes will impact the vaping industry? And also, what is the impact of those type of cigarettes in initiation of vaping or other tobacco products?
I think that in order for a rule like this to have the maximum positive intended population level impacts, for those smokers of addictive cigarettes who, for whatever reason, are going to seek nicotine from other sources, those other sources need to be made available to them. And I think that it needs to be the full spectrum of FDA-regulated products, whether it's products regulated under the Tobacco Control Act or therapeutic products regulated under the drug provisions. And I think that also needs to include innovation on the drug therapy side, because we're fighting this battle in 2023 with tools that date back 40, 50, or 60 years that in the real world are remarkably ineffective. So we need better tools on the treatment side, and there needs to be access and availability to alternative and less harmful tobacco products with nicotine in them. And it's why when I was advocating for this policy inside of government, it was only to be addressed to combustible products. And so I would expect that this would lead some subset of current smokers to migrate to any of the alternative and less harmful products: e-cigarettes, smokeless tobacco, heated tobacco products, nicotine pouches, you name it. And now that synthetic nicotine is no longer an issue for purposes of regulation, I think that those smokers will have options and presumably even more options over time for those who are seeking them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, in the research that I showed, the cigarette smokers that were assigned to very low nicotine content cigarette condition did migrate more, to the alternative nicotine delivery systems. Whether, as I have mentioned, whether we should be reducing the levels of nicotine in those products, the alternative nicotine products, it's hard to know, at this time, but certainly it shouldn't be reduced to the level that's similar to the combusted products. You need to have at least a level that people would want to migrate to, essentially.
And based on that question, how is the state of the evidence now in low nicotine cigarillos or little cigars?
What's the evidence at this point in time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we really don't have the availability of very low nicotine content little cigars as cigarillos, so there's no evidence, at this point in time. But because of some of the work that people like Wally Pickworth has done, where he showed that the PK, the rapidity of nicotine and the magnitude of nicotine is similar between the little cigars and cigarettes, as well as the toxicity profile is similar, then I would think that you would need to have this under, all these, the selected, as the FDA proposed rulemaking said, the selected combusted products under the nicotine product regulation.
And there's a public health imperative for the scope to go as far as Dorothy is saying, and that is, for a number of years now, more kids have initiated every day on cigars than on cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
We keep on referring only to the youth cigarette smoking rate. And while that is a historically low number, the rate of youth initiation of cigars is higher than youth initiation of cigarettes. Now, granted, that still is a low number, but I think that those numbers need to be added together, accounting for poly tobacco use. And we should not be looking at that youth use of combustible products solely as cigarettes if the data is clear that more kids experiment with cigars every day than cigarettes. And the ultimate unintended consequence for this policy is to simply just do whack-a-mole and migrate experimenters of any age to an equally harmful product because that wasn't included within the scope of the regulation.